Hi, I'm Stephanie Dennison, and I'm going to be talking about probabilistic inference in infancy and early childhood. Before I get started on that, I just want to say thanks to Michelle for organizing. I'm really looking forward to hearing all the talks today. So what do we know about probabilistic inference in infants? In one paradigm, what we found is that infants can make decisions based on proportional information in a probabilistic inference task. So in these experiments, infants see desirable objects, so that's these pink ones here, versus some less desirable objects, so some black items with nothing exciting about them. And we basically just see whether or not, if they see that one container has a higher proportion of pink and the other one has a higher proportion of black, if they can reason that on a blind draw from an experimenter, that the experimenter is most likely to get one of the desirable objects from the mostly pink container. So we just see whether or not infants will crawl or walk towards the correct cup containing a sample from the mostly pink population. And we generally find that 10 to 14-month-old infants make pretty good inferences in this case, so they pretty reliably choose the sample from the mostly pink population. There's lots of converging evidence from looking time experiments as well with young infants from a variety of labs, just again showing that infants will look longer at improbable samples from populations. So if you get a sample that really doesn't match the population very well in terms of the numerical properties, infants find that surprising or it violates their expectations. They look longer. There's converging evidence from non-human animals as well, so from non-human primates and capuchin monkeys for two, but there's also evidence from parrots and elephants and a number of other species at this point. I'll show you a video of a capuchin monkey doing this kind of experiment just for fun. So here the capuchin is presented with a population of mostly peanuts and a population of mostly pellets. And the capuchins strongly prefer the peanuts, so they're very motivated to get a peanut. And the experimenter takes a blind draw from each container that the capuchin can't see. So they can't see what the experimenter gets here. So you can see that this very smart monkey here went for the hand that was more likely to be holding a peanut than a pellet, even in this kind of tricky crossover situation, which half of the participants see. So I just showed you really quickly some evidence from monkeys, great apes, that they use very similar paradigms to the monkeys with the great apes, and pre-verbal infants, showing that they do make probabilistic inference is based on proportional information. But what's interesting in this literature is that there's been some mixed findings with preschoolers in terms of their abilities to do some very similar tasks. So my graduate student, or former graduate student, Samantha Gualtieri, and I have been looking at this for a couple of years. She's now a postdoc at the University of Toronto. But when she was in my lab, we started looking at the factors that might play a role in these discrepant findings that you see across the preschool literature itself, and then also between the preschool literature and the infant and animal literature. So there are two design type choices that seem to us that might make a difference when we were looking at the literature, and I'll explain those in detail in just a second. And then there's also a difference in paradigm that made us wonder if some executive demands might be different across the two types of paradigms. So the first sort of design feature is something called relative likelihood, and generally speaking, it seems that researchers in the probability literature have taken a little bit less systematic an approach with this feature than you might have otherwise expected. So these problems are different, these two that are here. So imagine that your goal is to get a blue item. And the problem on the right here, or at least my right, is actually easier than the problem on the left, just because the comparison that you're making is closer together over here than it is over here. So the relative likelihood between these two sets of arrays and these two sets of arrays is different. And because these are further apart from one another, they're easier. So this type of problem should be easier, generally speaking, mathematically. And interestingly, there hasn't been a lot of investigation into how much differences in relative likelihood matter in terms of kids' performance on these kinds of problems, or infants, or apes, or monkeys, for that matter. Another difference is really the type of problem that you present a participant with. So the feature we're looking at here is sort of the number of available shortcuts a participant might be able to use that don't require proportional reasoning but allow them to do something simpler. So these problems are really, really easy. So aside from the fact that the relative likelihood's really far apart, they're easy in a number of other ways. So this array has a better proportion of blue to black than this array, but it also has a higher absolute number of blue items, a larger amount of blue over here than blue over here. So you could just compare on that one dimension of blue across populations here, and you would get the right answer. It's also the case that you could just look at the individual populations to make your decisions instead of comparing across in terms of the actual proportions. So you could look here and say, oh, this is a good population. It mostly has the ones I want. And you can look here and say, well, this is a bad one. It mostly doesn't have the ones I want. And then you can decide to approach the one with more, or you could decide to avoid the one with less, but either way you'd get, again, the right answer without actually comparing the two proportions across. When you contrast this with this kind of problem over here, you can see why this is so easy and why this is so difficult. So if you tried to use the strategy of comparing absolute number or amount of blue, you'd be wrong in this problem because there's more blue over here in the less probable or worse proportioned population. You also couldn't use your strategy of just sort of saying that this is a good one and this is a good one, so I should approach, because you wouldn't know which to approach if you were just using that very straightforward approach a good population or approach a population that has more of the ones I want. You would be sort of stuck not knowing which one. You really have to compare across populations here to get this problem right. So this is sort of the two extremes of the easiest and the hardest problems that you might want to present a preschooler with, or an infant or an ape. There are also differences potentially across paradigms in the demands on executive functions, and I won't go into this in detail, but I think it's sort of intuitive. So in some ways, the infant and animal studies seem easier. So for one, the target item for the infant and animal studies is almost always sort of intrinsically motivating, so the food here or these very fancy lollipops, whereas for the preschoolers, you actually have to sort of explain to them the rules of the game. They have to keep in their mind that, for example, the red is the target here, and they have to remember that through the whole experiment. It's also the case that in the infant and animal setup, there are a lot of safeguards to sort of help those participants in terms of paying attention and then also inhibition. So actually the parent and the experimenter and the setup stops the participant in those kinds of paradigms from doing something they shouldn't or from losing attention. And this is much more strongly done than in the preschool studies where kids are sort of sitting across from an experimenter. They might reach for something too soon. They might stop paying attention, and there's less kind of keeping them on task. So in general, the preschool studies in some ways might place more demands on executive functioning than the infant studies and then the animal studies. So what we decided to do is just start looking at some of these factors. So we looked at these factors in 3 experiments. The first thing we did is actually just looked at with 3 and 4-year-olds whether or not individual differences in EF play a significant role in their probabilistic reasoning, just as a starting point. And then we also were mostly interested in identifying a battery of probability problems that might actually be able to diagnose probabilistic reasoning ability level, almost like the theory of mind scale or something like that. So where kids could get a score and kind of see where do they fall as the problems get harder and harder. So these are the problems that we used in experiment 3. This is the battery that I'll take you through. It isn't probably our final battery, but it's probably our best battery so far. So the A problems were the most difficult because they have no alternative strategies that you can use. So I just went through this demonstration before. You can't use any alternatives other than probabilistic or proportional reasoning to solve these problems. The problems labeled with a 2 across all the problems will be the easier problem in terms of relative likelihood all the time. So the relative likelihood of the 1 problems closer together, relative likelihood of the 2 problem further apart. The B problems are the easiest from that multiple alternative strategy point of view. You could use any number of strategies that aren't necessarily proportional reasoning to get these problems right. The C problems we're defining as sort of an intermediate problem because you could use one alternative strategy, but you can't really use multiple alternative strategies. So in these C problems, you can't use the strategy of just looking at comparing blue across populations because you'd actually get it wrong in this case if you did that. But you could use the strategy of comparing, is this a good population that I should approach? And is this a bad population that I should avoid? Because the problems are on opposite sides of 50%. So you have a good population and you have a bad population here. D problems were just non-probabilistic deterministic problems to make sure kids were on task. And E problems were also intermediate. So they again allowed one alternative strategy. In this case, they allow the alternative strategy of actually comparing the absolute amount of blue across populations, and you'd still be able to get it right without using proportional reasoning, but you can't use the good-bad population strategy. So you can see that in this case, actually, both populations would be avoided, so you'd need to compare across. I won't say much about the EF measures. We got an inhibitory control measure with flanker. We got a working memory measure with a path span task, and we got a cognitive flexibility measure with a DCCS. We made a composite score of EF for kids because they're 3 and 4. And here's what we found so far. So I'm not going to go into each experiment in detail. I'm going to try to give you an overall view. So the availability of shortcuts nearly always mattered for how good kids did on the problem. So children in this age group solved the easier problems really consistently across all 3 experiments. They chose at chance in the very hardest problems. So just to give you an idea, in experiment 1, we mostly used easier and intermediate problems, and you can see that kids were above chance. This is proportion of correct responses on every single kind of problem. Whereas in experiment 3, in the very hardest problems, remember those A problems were really hard in experiment 3, they're at chance. In the easiest problems, that was B, they're well above chance. And in the intermediate problems, you can see that they mostly were above chance, but they're kind of in between on those intermediate problems. And I won't show you, but in experiment 2, kids were above chance in all of the problems. We had mostly intermediate and some easier problems here. So basically, this was a battery of problems that were harder than the experiment 1 problems, easier than the experiment 3 problems. In terms of relative likelihood, it often mattered, but it didn't always matter. So there was no effect of relative likelihood in experiment 1, but there were consistent effects in both experiment 2 and 3. So in experiment 1, what you'll see is that the problems labeled with a 2 were not consistently harder for the kids than the problems labeled with a 1. So that's about equal here, harder here, not as hard here, all over the place. But in experiment 2, what we generally see, and there is a main effect of relative likelihood, is that those problems labeled with a 2, kids score better on. And experiment 3 was very similar. Kids are scoring better on the problems labeled with a 2. So generally speaking, what we're sort of seeing here is that if a problem's really straightforward, like most of the experiment 1 problems were, they were all very straightforward from this availability of shortcut perspective, then relative likelihood mattered less. But it matters a little bit more as the problems get more challenging in other ways, which is pretty interesting. The contribution of individual differences in EF was weird. So the composite EF score that we used explained 48% of the variance in kids' probability performance in experiment 1, but only about 10% in experiments 2 and 3. So it was significant. It was a significant predictor in experiment 1 and not in experiments 2 and 3. So we're actually not entirely sure what to make of all of that at this point. In terms of our sort of ongoing work and general discussion, so kids' performance was better than we expected on many problems, but they did in fact struggle with the very hardest problems. Those problems are notably harder than the ones that monkeys and infants have really reliably solved. But there have been at least a couple experiments that suggest that infants might be able to solve some of these hardest problems as well as apes. So it might be worth looking back at those again and seeing what's going on there, that the infants might be getting those right where preschoolers might be getting it wrong. For future directions, we want to just continue refining this current battery. We want to definitely more systematically manipulate the relative likelihoods. We weren't particularly systematic in that. We just took a shot at it to start. And we might consider doing something like manipulating the executive functioning demands of the task or manipulating cognitive load to look at the contribution of EF, since looking at these correlations and predictions didn't work quite as well as we might have guessed. I need to acknowledge my entire lab, my collaborators, especially my co-author Samantha, and thank you all so much for listening.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming to our symposium today. My name is Michelle Hurst. I'm a postdoc at the University of Chicago, and today I'm going to talk about children's use of proportion when it's only one possible piece of information that's available and that might actually be traded off with other quantitative information. So imagine you're looking for a new job and you're lucky enough to get 2 great offers. To compare them, you might start thinking about what's important to you in a work environment. And so you look up how diverse the employee makeup is in terms of people of color and women. So first, you look at your team. Who will you interact with most? And what you notice is that in company A, you'll interact with more women and people of color on a regular basis. And so that's great. You might start leaning toward company A. Then you look at what the company looks like as a whole across all divisions. And now what you notice is that company B actually has a larger percentage of the total company that are women and people of color. And this information, this percentage information, could tell you something different about the company, such as the larger scale policies, beliefs, or culture. And so how you weight these 2 pieces of information, the absolute number and the relative percentage, might impact your decision about which company to join. And so what I'm broadly interested in is what impacts the relative weight that people give to these 2 types of quantitative information. Today, I'm going to be particularly focused on what impacts whether or not children will attend to proportional information in particular. And so what I'm going to show you is that the perceptual characteristics of the quantitative display can change what information children rely on to make decisions by making some information more salient than other information. And importantly, I'll suggest that this is domain general. The same perceptual characteristics impact saliency of proportion in a range of contexts. And today I'll talk about probability, where proportion is objectively the correct strategy to use. I'll talk about children's understanding of the quantifier most, where the context should elicit a proportional interpretation. And I'll talk about children's social evaluations based on the amount shared or resource distribution, where there isn't an objectively correct answer, but we do see conventional preferences in adults. So the perceptual characteristic that I'm going to look at today is the discreteness of the stimuli. So what do I mean by that? Consider these visual stimuli, all of which convey proportional information. There's 2 discrete stimuli on the left and 1 continuous on the right. So all of these displays actually show the same proportional values, or the equivalent ratio of 3:1 red to blue. But the discrete dot arrays also have very specific fractional values of 6/8 and 3/4. So they're equivalent to each other in terms of proportion, but they're different in their exact fractions. The continuous area model on the right, on the other hand, is of course equivalent to all of these, but it doesn't have a precise fraction value. It's as much 3/4 as it is 6/8. And so what this means is that the discrete stimuli on the left have both proportional and numerical information available, but the continuous stimulus on the right only has proportional information available. It does not have any discrete numerical information about the components. And so the claim that I'm going to make today is that the availability of this numerical information, because of the perceptual discreteness of the display, will actually decrease the saliency of proportional information, which might then impact children's behavior. So today I'm going to ask whether across these three contexts, children use different information when the quantitative displays are discrete, highlighting number, or continuous, highlighting proportion. And I'm going to start with probability. So in the probability task, we introduce 6-year-olds to a game where if the spinner lands on red, they win stickers, but if the spinner lands on blue, I take their stickers away. Then I show them 2 spinners and I ask them to choose which spinner will help them get more stickers. These spinners are divided into discrete pieces. Now they're not discrete in the same way as those dot arrays that are entirely discrete with separate dots, but they are discrete in the way that's critical here, in that there are 2 pieces of information available: the proportion of red and the number of red pieces or segments. And so because both of these pieces of information are available, we can manipulate them so that sometimes they're consistent with each other. So here the option on the right has both numerically and proportionally more red. And sometimes we can make it so they're inconsistent, meaning the numerical information is misleading. Here, the option on the left has proportionally more red, and the option on the right has numerically more red. And then to see the impact of this numerical information, we compare these discrete trials to matched continuous trials. So there's nothing consistent or misleading about these continuous trials because there is no numerical information to be consistent or misleading, but they are matched to that proportional magnitude. So then the question is, do children change their strategy when this numerical information is available on discrete trials, potentially relying less on proportion in these discrete trials? So what I'm showing you here is proportion correct on consistent and misleading trials for continuous and discrete stimuli. I'm showing you the continuous stimuli here. These are like our baseline trials. We can see that children are able to use proportional information well above chance. But what we really care about is what happens when we make numerical information available on those discrete trials. Do we see children's behavior change? And so what we see is that when numerical information is available and consistent, it seems to help children. Their performance improves. But when that discrete numerical information is available and misleading, it hurts their performance. Their performance goes down. And so we do see this expected interaction, which we take as evidence that children are using numerical information when it's available on those discrete trials. And so they seem to be ignoring proportion and overweighting that numerical information when it's available relative to when it's not. And so what we see is, yes, we do see evidence of this discrete versus continuous difference impacting strategy selection in the context of probability. So now what I want to do is turn to children's proportional interpretation of the quantifier most. So Jessica Sullivan and colleagues designed a really nice experiment to try to elicit children's proportional interpretation of most. And they pit a proportional interpretation of most against an absolute or more interpretation of most. So here, John with the yellow balloons had 5 and popped 3. Amanda with the blue balloons had 9 and popped 4. And here, John popped most of his balloons, but popped fewer than Amanda. Whereas Amanda did not pop most of her balloons, but she popped more than John. And so when Sullivan and colleagues asked kids, set up kids with these kinds of questions and asked who popped most of their balloons, what they found was that 4 to 6-year-olds actually selected the one who popped more, suggesting that they have a misunderstanding of the quantifier most, and instead of interpreting it in this proportional way, seem to be interpreting it in a more absolute way. But these stimuli are precisely those stimuli that might actually decrease the saliency of proportion. And so maybe it's not actually about a misunderstanding of the word most. Maybe it's just that absolute number is more salient in this context. So to test this, we replicated Sullivan and colleagues' discrete stimuli, but created matched stimuli where we reduce the saliency of numerical information by removing the number words and presenting the information continuously. So here I'm showing you the proportion of trials where children are selecting the correct proportional response on both the continuous and discrete blocks. In the discrete blocks, we replicate Sullivan and colleagues' findings that children have a strong preference for choosing the absolutely more option instead of the proportional option. But on those continuous blocks, we see that children are significantly more proportional than on those discrete blocks. And in fact, they're more proportional than chance. Okay, so again, we see the same impact of the perceptual saliency of absolute versus proportional information. And so now the last context we're going to look at is social evaluations based on resource distribution. So imagine you're shown these two characters who share some of their resources, but one of them shared proportionally more, but numerically fewer, and the other shared absolutely more, but proportionally less. What's interesting about this context is that there is no objectively correct answer, but we do see conventional behavior in adults. So when Colleen McCrink and colleagues gave questions like this to 4- and 5-year-olds and to adults, they found that adults tended to select the character who shared proportionally more as being nicer, whereas 4- and 5-year-olds tended to choose the character who shared absolutely more as being nicer, suggesting that there might be some sort of protracted development of children's ability to use proportion in social evaluations. But again, these stimuli are exactly the kinds of stimuli that we think decrease the perceptual saliency of proportional information. And so what I did was create a task that's the same basic paradigm, but made the stimuli the best case scenario for highlighting proportion. So for an example, we introduce children to a hippo whose favorite color is red. And we tell children that the elephants are friends with the hippo and the elephants have some blue stuff. We then tell them that this elephant gives the hippo this much red, and this elephant gives the hippo this much red. We then ask children to decide which elephant is nicer. So to directly compare children's tendency to rely on proportion, we compared this continuous paradigm to a discrete version where the same resources are presented, just divided up. And like McCrink and colleagues, we pit absolute amount shared against proportional amount shared so that we can see which of these two quantitative dimensions children are using to make their decision. So what I'm showing you here is from a sample of 4- and 5-year-olds and the number of trials on which they selected the proportional response. And so what we see is, as expected, children are more proportional with the continuous resources than with the discrete resources. So even in this social context where there is no right answer, this discreteness of the stimuli does seem to influence children's strategy selection. So overall, there does seem to be a domain general variation that impacts children's overall tendency to use proportion, and that this variation may be based on the perceptual saliency of absolute versus proportional information. But a key feature of this is that it's about the perceptual features that impact the relative saliency. And so far, I've only shown you evidence from one perceptual characteristic, the discreteness. So what about other perceptual features? Well, in the case of social evaluations, there's another perceptual feature that might be at play. So typical resource distribution scenarios are discrete. They're separate countable resources like stickers or cookies, but they're also spatially disconnected or separated. So the shared amount moves away from the non-shared amount. And so what we hypothesize is that this spatial separateness might also be decreasing the saliency of proportion because it's sort of more difficult or less transparent to compare those two parts when they're separated. So what we did is we compared, again, children's performance with this sort of best case scenario proportion version of the paradigm to a version where those resources are spatially separated. So again, I'm showing you here the proportion of trials where children are relying on proportion. And we again find that children are more proportional with connected resources than separated resources. So we do see the same phenomenon in the case of other perceptual features, here the spatial separateness, that we think change the saliency of the proportion. And so it might be that any low-level perceptual feature that impacts the relative saliency of proportional versus absolute amount will also impact children's strategy selection. So today, I hope I've convinced you that children's strategies, particularly proportional strategies, are influenced by perceptual features of the display that are independent of the specific domain. And importantly, this has methodological implications because we might be underestimating children's use of proportion-based strategies across a range of topics in cognitive development, where we're relying on displays that decrease the relative saliency of proportion in a way that's orthogonal to the concept that we're trying to study. Importantly, this also has theoretical implications about the development of children's quantitative reasoning in particular. And one thing I'm particularly excited about in some ongoing and future work is how the relative saliency of different quantitative information might actually change over development. So how do children learn to weight absolute and proportional information differently in different contexts as they learn context-specific concepts about what might be most relevant to solve that particular problem? And so with that, I will say thank you for listening.
Hi, thanks for coming to our session. I'm Yunji Park from UW-Madison, and I'm going to present our study looking at the developments of ratio magnitudes and simple magnitude perception. Numerous studies have demonstrated that we humans have the ability to extract many different forms of quantity information from our environments. For example, when we perceive how far people are socially distancing each other or how many kids wear masks. Not just outside, even at our home, when we make lemonade, we perceive the amount of water, the number of lemons we put, and at the end, we care about how sour the lemonade is. And these different types of magnitude can be classified as two types. One is simple magnitude, which indicates a raw amount of magnitude that can be measured in solitudes. For example, in this case, the amount of water and the number of lemons or sizes of the lemons can be simple magnitudes. Other type of quantity is relational magnitudes, which is emerged from comparative relations among simple magnitudes. In this case, the sourness of lemonade can be relational magnitudes, which determined by the relationship between the amount of water and the number of lemons. One of the relational magnitude that we can visualize is non-symbolic ratio magnitudes. Non-symbolic ratio magnitude is consisted of two simple magnitudes. Here, two different lines make a line ratio. If we say the ratio of yellow to blue line, the ratio magnitude of this figure is 1 to 4. And the line ratio in figure A is smaller than the line ratio in figure B, which indicates 8 to 9. Also, the important characteristic of ratio magnitude is the sizes of the components are not important. So if you look at the figure C and compare with figure A, even though the lengths of the lines of figure C are smaller, the ratio can be larger. A lot of studies have used comparison paradigms to explore magnitude perceptual abilities by specifically looking at individuals' discriminability, the acuity for magnitudes, and comparing across formats. However, the majority of these investigations have been limited to exploring representations of simple magnitudes. So in contrast, comparatively little is known about ratio magnitude perception. Furthermore, the extent to which processing of ratio and simple magnitudes are related remain unclear. The one major question we wanted to ask in our study was how ratio processing and simple magnitude processing are related. About this matter, there are two competing hypotheses. First one is that both simple and ratio magnitudes are processed by a shared system. The second one is that each magnitude might be processed by a separate system. I will go into a bit more about these two hypotheses. Hypothesis 1 has been argued based on the psychophysics of magnitude discrimination. According to the previous studies, the discriminability between two simple magnitudes follow Weber's law. In Weber's law, the discriminability depends on the ratio between two magnitudes, and the discrimination becomes harder as the ratio between magnitudes gets close to 1. So studies with infants show that they can discriminate 1 to 2 ratio, but not to 3. Thus, discriminability of simple magnitude can be parameterized in terms of ratio. Furthermore, simple magnitude discrimination tasks are often characterized as subtraction in logarithmically transformed space. And if we take this space at the end, it is mathematically same as taking ratio between two magnitudes. Thus, Chesney and Matthews hypothesized that the number of dots and the ratio consisted of the pairs of dot arrays might be processed by a common system, and we applied this to other simple magnitudes. On the other hand, some researchers proposed that perception of simple and ratio magnitude might be more distinct. Some propose that there is a ratio processing system in our brain that is specifically dedicated to process non-symbolic ratio magnitudes. Quite a number of studies have found that humans, even 6-month infants, and also non-human as monkey parrots can discriminate non-symbolic ratio magnitudes. This theory further hypothesized that the RPS supports the acquisitions of fractions knowledge. The evidence that the RPS ability predicted the fraction knowledge and even algebra ability in others support the RPS theory. Therefore, our study's first aim was to explore the relationship between simple and ratio magnitudes by using comparison tasks with various formats of magnitude, including line, circle, blob, and dots. Participants' job was to choose which magnitude is larger, especially in the ratio comparison task. The participants compared the ratio of yellow to blue. So yellow to blue line length, circle or blob areas, and number of dots. And we wanted to specifically looking at the relationships of acuities across different formats. If there is a shared processing system between simple and ratio magnitudes, the relationship across comparison tasks depends more on formats. So in other words, line comparison will better predict line ratio comparison. Circle area comparison will better predict circle ratio comparison. In contrast, if the processing of two magnitude is distinct, the relationship across comparison tasks depends more on the magnitude type. Thus, ratio magnitudes, ratio acuities will be related to each other regardless of format differences, rather than related with any simple magnitudes. Adding to that, our question number 2 was to expand the understanding of the development of ratio magnitudes. Previous studies have shown well about differential developmental trajectories of simple magnitude and simple magnitude acuity across multiple formats. So the studies found that each format had distinctive developmental trajectories such that line length acuity developed faster than number acuity. Therefore, as our second goal, we aim to investigate the development of ratio magnitudes and format differences and compare with that of simple magnitudes. So far, there are no data available that have systematically compared different formats in different age ranges. Therefore, to these aims, we collected preschooler, second grader, fifth grader, and undergraduate students. We conducted 2 sessions. Children conducted flanker and 4 different magnitude comparison tasks in session 1. In session 2, children conducted 4 ratio comparison tasks. However, since young children had no prior formal instruction on ratio, and non-symbolic ratio representation itself was novel, so all children received a brief PowerPoint introduction introducing a concept of ratio for each format. For example, prior to blob ratio comparison, the instruction introduced basic ratio concepts through blob-like cartoon characters. If we introduce the part of instruction briefly, this is boba, this is blobby. Blobby size is half as big as boba. When we think of boba and blobby sizes together, we call it ratio. At first, we started with the introduction of the half and extend this to the concept that bigger ratio is one that 2 magnitudes are more similar to each other. I introduced our comparison task briefly, just to refresh. There were 4 ratio comparison and 4 magnitude comparison tasks. The level of difficulty was defined by the ratio between 2 magnitudes, and we had 5 ratio distance bins. The ratio distance bins were different between ratio and simple magnitude comparison because the difficulty of the task itself was different. With the data, we first conducted mixed effect logistic regression models for accuracy for each magnitude task. The graph shows how accuracy looked like by format in each age group. If you look at graph of youngest group, each data point indicates each individual's mean accuracy, and the box plot shows the quantiles. If we look at the trend, we can see in the order of line, circle, block, dots, overall accuracy decreased. This format effect was also shown in other groups. In addition to this, we also found significant age effects. Older participants showed higher accuracy. Lastly, the graph doesn't show this, but individuals' performance followed Faber's law. As the ratio distance decreased, the accuracy became low. Similar format effects, age and ratio distance effect were found in ratio comparison task 2. To see the relationship between simple and ratio magnitude, we conducted hierarchical regression models predicting each ratio acuity. For each ratio formats, accuracies were regressed against flanker and aging month as control, all simple magnitude comparisons, magnitude acuities, and remaining ratio acuities. So interestingly, the best predictors for each ratio acuity were ratio acuity in different format, in other format, not magnitude acuity. Only the model predicting dot ratio, line ratio has turned out to be a significant predictor, but also with other ratio acuities. So one of our competing hypotheses from Chesney and Matthews' expectation was within format relationship, such that dot acuity predicts dot ratio acuity, but there was no within format relationship found between ratio and simple magnitudes. To sum up, our research presented evidence of early development of non-symbolic ratio magnitudes. We found even children as young as 4-year-olds can represent non-symbolic ratio magnitude in multiple formats, and their representation followed Faber's law. Also, we found all ratio acuities improved during development, regardless of format, even prior to fraction instructions. So our research may suggest a strong role of biological maturations for the development of ratio magnitude acuities representations. Also, we found that at the group level difference, Non-symbolic ratio and simple magnitude activities were similar during development. Both magnitudes showed similar formative effects. Also, due to the time limit, I didn't talk about this in the result, but the developmental speed of each magnitude was not so different. So these results seem to support shared processing of simple and ratio magnitudes. However, it turned out when we looked at the direct relationship, the individual differences were not related to each other. So it may indicate ratio magnitude representation might be to a certain extent independent from simple magnitudes representations, so which largely support the distinctive processing of ratio magnitudes. So far, a substantial body of research has suggested that numerical intuition finds their deepest roots in simple magnitudes. Recently, however, several researchers have proposed that ratio perception may serve as a neurocognitive foundations that support formation of numeric concept, not only including whole number, but also fractions and real numbers. Our study may provide overall in an evidence suggesting ratio perception as a form of number sense and may broaden the definition of number sense. Thanks for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, so thanks to Michelle Hurst for organizing this session. And so I'm going to talk about some of our comparative studies on quantitative representations of different dimensions like number, space, and ordinal sequences in human adults, kids, and non-human primates. And the reason that we work across species, development, and we also work across different cultures is because those groups reveal different constraints on cognition. So evolutionary, developmental, and cultural influences. And to try to figure out what causes what, it's useful to look at these different influences in parallel with the same questions, the same tasks, the same stimuli. And one of the foundational findings in this comparative literature is that that's relevant to what I'm talking about today is that all of these different groups can estimate quantities regardless of their different developmental trajectories and different experiences. So this here is a video of a monkey, and her task is to first press that black square in the bottom corner of the screen to indicate that she's ready to go. Then there's two visual arrays that pop up, and she's supposed to hit the array with the smaller number of dots first, and then hit the array with the larger number. And when she gets the right answer, she gets a juice treat from the straw that she's holding at the front of her chair. And we and others have shown that primates and other non-human animals can do really well on these numerosity tasks. They can perform with a really high accuracy. And so can babies and kids. So even babies and young kids who don't yet talk or know how to count. So there's lots of people who study this and related phenomena in kids. And then also groups of people who don't have formal education, who maybe don't read and write, and who don't use counting, verbal counting very much in their everyday language, can also do these kinds of quantity tasks. So this is a picture here of a Chamane woman from a group in the Amazon region in Bolivia. So folks who live in these villages aren't literate. They don't use counting or number words very much in their daily lives, and yet all of these groups can judge the relative quantity of sets of items in numerosity tasks, for example. And there are similarities in how these different groups perform these kinds of quantity tasks. So this is an example comparing numerosity discrimination for monkeys and for adult humans when the humans weren't allowed to count. And what's shown here is that accuracy during numerical discrimination in a task like the one I just showed in the video is very similar for monkeys and humans. So you can see that both groups generally perform well above chance, so chance is around 50%. But you can also see that performance gets worse for both groups as the numerical ratio between the items that's shown to them increases. So it's a lot easier for people and monkeys to do the task at small numerical ratios compared to large ones. So they're better at comparing values when the comparison is something like 2 versus 30 dots, which is around a 0.1 ratio, than if they had like 28 versus 38 dots, which is around a 0.9 ratio. So accuracy in this kind of rapid numerical discrimination depends on the ratios of the numerical values that are being compared. And this pattern indicates that the subjects are using approximate analog numerical thinking as opposed to precise digital thinking. This is a visualization of analog representation. So as the actual objective number that's shown to the subject gets larger, the probability of noise in the animals or person's representation increases. And so these distributions are getting fatter. And so the probability of overlap or of confusion between numbers also increases. And then the probability that the individual will have a subjective representation of that objective number decreases. And that's why we see this ratio effect in performance on these quantity tasks. So it falls out of these proportional relations among analog representations. And this kind of analog thinking isn't just for numerical values, so it's not just for numerosity tasks, but you see signatures of it for basically anything that subjects are judging that's unidimensional. And so this is an example here of how people rate the roughness of sandpaper. So this is from Stephen's old work. And you can see that the ratings overlap more as roughness increases. So that curve is kind of flattening out. Representations are getting less distinct. And this general pattern also applies to lots of other dimensions. So brightness, length, loudness, vibration, many others. There's a psychological relation between different dimensions. So this graph is showing that people can rate one dimension using another dimension. So for example, they can rate how bright a light is by adjusting the volume of a pure tone. So the brighter it is, the louder you make the tone. And these lines show that people's adjustments are systematic and proportional between all of these different dimensions. So it's possible to translate values between dimensions, and people have asked a lot of questions about these psychological relations, like where do they come from, what's the locus, what's the psychological locus of the interaction between dimensions, and whether these relations are inherent in how people perceive things, or whether they're made up. Do people just sort of learn them and make them up on the fly? So people can relate different dimensions to one another, and there are a lot of questions about how. One question that we asked recently is whether people track relations between dimensions spontaneously. And we also asked at what level of detail do they track relations between different dimensions. So we recently showed that people connect different continua spontaneously by bringing them into a common psychological space. So people create abstract representations across different continua by representing them all as ratio scales. And so Corey Bond did this study where he had people rate sequences using a slider to rate these sequences that they were exposed to from very similar to very different. And people would see 3 items in sequence, and then they'd see another 3 items in sequence, and then they'd rate the similarity between those 2 sequences. And he had conditions where the 2 sequences that were presented were different. He had a condition where their rank relations were the same, but the absolute values were different. So it would be something like medium, large, small, but with different absolute sizes between the sequences. And he had a condition where rank and ratio were the same between sequences, but there were different absolute values. So this would be like medium, large, and small, but with the same proportion changes between the items across those two sequences, but different absolute values between them. And what he found is that people rated the sequences where ratio was preserved as more similar than if just rank was preserved. We also tested between dimensions, so loudness to size. So this is an auditory to visual comparison, and we found the same pattern. So people are sensitive to the ratio relations in the sequences, even for sequences that are presented across modalities. We also tested and found the same pattern for spatial height to auditory pitch, so pitch height, number to duration, and size to number. And what this means more generally is that translating quantitative dimensions from absolute values to ratio-based scales is an internal transformation that people do spontaneously. So in this case, they're just rating similarity. There was no requirement to track that property of the sequences, but they did track it and they reported it spontaneously. So there's this internal transformation that people do, taking sequences from absolute values to ratio scales. And the reason they do this is to get different dimensions into the same psychological space so that they can be compared. So it's a kind of normalization. And so what this shows is that people spontaneously use this proportional scaling by ratio to compare different quantities, and they can even do that between modalities. So is this proportional scaling something that you can do at will, or is it something fundamental to how magnitudes are encoded? So is this specific to these sort of natural quantity dimensions that we encounter in our environments, or is this scaling something that you just make up as you go along? So we wanted to test subjects on new sequences that were arbitrary and see how they do when they have to compare between them. So this video here is just showing the task. So I'm only presenting the human data today, but this monkey is going to demonstrate the ordinal task that we're using. So this is an ordinal sequencing task where subjects learn to order pictures in an arbitrary order. The strip at the bottom of the screen here is showing the correct order. So the subject's given an array of photographs and learns by trial and error to touch the pictures in the correct sequence. So there's a hidden correct order and they have to discover it by trial and error. When they're correct, they get a bing and a pink screen. The monkeys get candy, kids get stickers. And when they're wrong, the screen turns black for a timeout of a couple of seconds. Okay, and so in this study, we are using that task and we're training subjects with lists of different lengths. And so here we're training a 4-item list, so 4 unique pictures, and a 7-item list, so 7 unique pictures. During the training, subjects discover the list order by trial and error, and then they have to produce that correct order 5 times in a row with no mistake in order to complete the training. So that's our criterion. And here we're testing 3 to 5-year-old kids and adult humans because we're beginning to look at how development and culture and species shape these sequencing processes. And children and adults are good at learning this task. So these graphs are showing average performance across the last half of that training period. So this is just to show that subjects know the orders of these different items in both the 4-item list and in the 7-item list. They're generally good at pressing the items in their correct order. And then once they reach our accuracy criterion during training, they move on to testing. During testing, subjects are asked to compare items between lists. So during testing, subjects are now presented with pairs of items and they're asked to press the one that comes first. So there's these between list pairs. We also mix in within list pairs so that we can be sure that subjects remember the original sequences. And now we want to test how they spontaneously rank items when they have to go between lists. So we already saw from training that kids can order each of these sequences. So the 7-item list in green and the 4-item list in pink. And now the question is, what kind of representation do they use to compare between these sequences that they just learned? And there are two options. One is to represent each sequence in an absolute code like is shown here. So in an absolute code, if you compare between sequences, then 7A and 4A are going to be equal. They're in equal ordinal positions, so that's a tie. 7B and 4B should be a tie, 7C and 4C, etc. So when you're comparing between lists in an absolute code, items with the same ordinal position should be roughly equal. So like if you had to compare 7B to 4C, you would rank 7B above 4C if you're using an absolute code. Another option is to use a relative code like this. And in this kind of code, the sequences are mentally normalized to each other. So the smaller sequence is stretched out to fit into the psychological space of the larger sequence. And this would mean that the positions of the items between sequences are proportional to each other instead of absolute. So like 7B is not equal to 4B. 7B here would come before 4B. And 7C comes before 4C, and 7D might even come before 4C. So this is a relative code. And what we see people doing in our data is a relative code. So these are the data from the 3 to 5-year-old little kids. When you give kids the between sequence pairs and you ask them which comes first, they say that 7B comes before 4B, 7C comes before 4C, and 7D even comes before 4C. And it's not the case that kids just have a general preference for choosing the longer list first, because they rank 7E after 4A, they rank 7F after 4B, and they rank 7G after 4C. So this pattern of responses is what you'd expect to see in a relative code, not in an absolute code. This is more evidence that both adults and kids are representing these sequences in a relative code. So the x-axis here is the distance between items in a proportional code, where both sequences are normalized into that common space. So these are the proportional differences on the x-axis. On the y-axis is the percentage of trials where subjects chose the 4-item member of the pair as coming first. And on the left side of the graph is where the 4-item member is predicted to come first. At the middle of the graph is where the 4 and the 7-item are predicted to be equal rank based on proportional distance. And then on the right side of the graph is where the 7-item member should come first under this code. And so you can see that subjects are choosing the correct item to come first in the sequence based on these predictions that the proportional distance between items on this normalized scale accounts for variance in their performance. So this proportional distance model is a good predictor of subjects' spontaneous ordering between lists. And interestingly here, the 3 to 5-year-old little kids are as sensitive to these proportional differences as are adults. And that's surprising because kids are usually less sensitive than adults on most tasks. There's some older evidence that monkeys do this kind of thing too. I don't think I have time to cover this, so I'm just going to skip it, but there's some evidence that this type of proportional coding might be universal among primates. One feature of performance that we observe that could be learned with experience related to maturation or culturally acquired is that adults showed a greater effect of rank on their performance compared to kids. So these are data showing the percent of trials where subjects ranked an item first depending on its true ordinal rank, which is on the x-axis. And so here we excluded any ties and just looked at the effect of ordinal rank. on performance. And you can see here that adults show a much sharper function here than kids. So although adults showed clear effects of proportional coding, it could be the case that adults have both kinds of representations, both absolute and relative. And that could be the reason adults show stronger effects of rank here compared to kids. So we're interested in whether this effect of rank is something that changes over development as children acquire either greater memory capacity or learn to represent sequences precisely during counting or in abstract memorized routines. Okay, so just to summarize, the representation of quantity is universal across species, over stages of development, across cultures, and it's represented in an analog code. Quantitative representations are translated into abstract ratio scales that people use spontaneously to compare quantities across dimensions. And people can make proportional comparisons across sequences on the fly, including of sequences that are arbitrary and that they just learned that day. And to do that, they normalize the sequences into a common psychological space and compare them proportionally with this relative code. And we think of these properties of continua as primitive constructions of the primate mind that help individuals connect different quantitative dimensions and sequences for manipulation and mapping. I want to thank the students who did these studies. I especially want to thank my lab manager, Nuar Al-Zalgul, who did the proportional scaling study. Thank you.